In the summer of 421 before the birth of Christ, a woman named Umelia stood among the ruins of her home in the city of Mantinea, watching as Spartan soldiers systematically separated the surviving population into groups. Umelia was 26 years old, the wife of a hoplite warrior named Cleomenes, who had died 3 days earlier defending the city walls during the final Spartan assault. She had 3 children, 2 daughters aged 7 and 5, and a son aged 3. For 3 days she had hidden with her children in the cellar of her house, while the battle raged above, listening to the sounds of combat, the screams of the dying, the eventual silence that meant the city had fallen. Now Spartan officers moved through the ruins, organizing the survivors. The men who had surrendered, those few who remained alive, were being marched away in chains. The elderly and very young children were being gathered separately. And the women of childbearing age, women like Umelia, were being assembled into another group, examined by Spartan commanders who walked among them, assessing them like one might assess livestock at a market. Umelia held her children close, trying to make herself invisible, hoping that perhaps she and her family would be overlooked, that they might somehow escape whatever fate the Spartans had planned. But a Spartan officer approached her, looked at her appraisingly, and asked her age and whether the children with her were hers. When she answered, he nodded and made a mark on a wax tablet he carried, then moved on to the next woman without explanation. That evening, Umelia and approximately 200 other women from Mantinea were separated from their children and marched out of the city under Spartan guard. The women's screams and pleas as they were torn from their children echoed through the ruins. Umelia's 3-year-old son cried out for her, trying to run after her, held back by an elderly woman who had been designated to care for the children left behind. Umelia looked back, trying to memorize her children's faces, having no idea if she would ever see them again, feeling something inside her break as the distance between them grew. The women were marched for 3 days, given minimal food and water, sleeping on the ground at night under guard, moving steadily toward Sparta. Many of them had never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace. None of them knew what awaited them when they reached the Spartan homeland, but they had heard stories, whispered tales of what happened to captured women, stories that made death seem preferable to survival. What happened to Umelia and the other women of Mantinea over the months and years that followed would exemplify the Spartan approach to conquest, an approach that understood that destroying an enemy meant not just killing their men, but systematically targeting their women, erasing their culture, absorbing their bloodlines, and creating a living reminder that resistance to Sparta was worse than futile. It was catastrophic, not just for those who died, but for those who survived. But before I tell you what happened to Umelia, before I reveal the specific fates that awaited captured women in Sparta, before I explain why ancient sources describe this treatment as worse than death, I need to tell you about Sparta itself, about how this unique Greek city-state organized its entire society around warfare and conquest, and about how the treatment of defeated enemies' wives became a crucial part of maintaining Spartan power and identity. This is the story of what Spartans did to the wives of defeated warriors, why these practices were considered fates worse than death even in an ancient world accustomed to brutality, and how Sparta's systematic targeting of women served strategic purposes that went far beyond the battlefield. And I need you to understand from the beginning that everything I describe is documented in ancient sources: Plutarch, Xenophon, Herodotus, Thucydides, historians, who wrote about Spartan practices based on their own observations, or in accounts from people who had experienced or witnessed these events. If you want to understand how conquest has targeted women throughout history, how systematic practices of forced reproduction and identity erasure have functioned as weapons of war, how societies can normalize atrocities by framing them as strategic necessities, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what you're about to learn will change how you understand ancient warfare and how women have been systematically targeted throughout military history. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you know about Sparta. Now let me tell you about the Spartan system, because to understand what happened to women like Umelia, you need to understand how Sparta organized its entire society around the production of warriors and the maintenance of military supremacy. Sparta was unique among Greek city-states. While Athens developed democracy and philosophy and art, while other Greek cities built monuments and pursued trade and created cultural achievements, Sparta dedicated itself entirely to warfare. Every aspect of Spartan society was organized around creating the most effective warriors possible and maintaining military dominance over both neighboring Greek states and over the massive population of enslaved people, called helots, who worked Spartan lands and allowed Spartan citizens to focus entirely on military training. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and raised by the state in a brutal training system called the agoge. They learned to fight, to endure pain, to obey orders without question, to value the state above all else, including their own lives and families. They lived in communal barracks, ate together, trained together, fought together. Individual identity was suppressed in favor of collective identity as Spartans. Weakness was not tolerated. Infants judged too weak or deformed were reportedly exposed and left to die. The society was organized entirely around producing warriors who would fight effectively as a unit and who would never retreat or surrender, regardless of circumstances. Spartan men were warriors first, and everything else second. They did not work the land. That was done by helots. They did not engage in trade or crafts. Those were beneath them or handled by a class of non-citizens called perioikoi. They existed to fight, and they were extraordinarily good at it. For centuries, Sparta fielded the most feared military force in the Greek world, an army of professional warriors who had trained for combat their entire lives. But maintaining this system required certain elements that shaped Spartan ideology and practice. First, Sparta needed a large population of enslaved helots to work the land and support the warrior class. The helots vastly outnumbered Spartan citizens, perhaps 10 helots for every Spartan, creating a constant fear of helot rebellion that influenced how Sparta treated both helots and defeated enemies. Second, Sparta needed to maintain its citizen population by producing enough children to replace warriors who died in battle. And third, Sparta needed to ensure that defeated enemies could never rise again to threaten Spartan power. These requirements led Sparta to develop systematic practices for dealing with conquered populations, particularly with the women of defeated enemies. And these practices went far beyond simple enslavement or killing. They involved deliberate targeting of women for purposes that combined pragmatic strategy with psychological warfare, reproductive control with cultural destruction. Let me tell you about the first principle of Sparta's approach to captured women, the understanding that women were the key to destroying an enemy permanently. Killing the men of a defeated city removed one generation of warriors. But the women would bear the next generation, and if allowed to maintain their cultural identity and pass it on to their children, they could create a new generation of enemies. So Sparta developed methods to prevent this, methods that involved controlling women's reproduction, erasing their cultural identity, and absorbing them into Spartan society in ways that ensured their children would serve Sparta, rather than seeking revenge for their defeated fathers. When Sparta conquered a city or defeated an enemy in battle, the treatment of surviving populations followed certain patterns that were refined over centuries of conquest. The male warriors would typically be killed, either in battle or after surrender. Male civilians of military age might also be executed or enslaved, depending on how fiercely the city had resisted. Elderly people and very young children were sometimes allowed to remain in the conquered territory under Spartan oversight, or they might be relocated or enslaved depending on circumstances. But women of childbearing age, roughly ages 15 to 40, received special attention because they represented both a threat and an opportunity. These women would be gathered and assessed by Spartan commanders. The assessment considered several factors: their age and apparent health, their social status in the conquered city, whether they had valuable skills, and whether they had children. Based on this assessment, the women would be divided into groups, each destined for different fates within the Spartan system. Some would become helots, added to the massive enslaved population that worked Spartan land. These women would labor in fields and in Spartan households, their children born into helot status, their lives defined by endless work, under brutal conditions, with no hope of freedom. But enslavement, as terrible as it was in some ways the least horrifying fate that awaited captured women, because at least helot women retained some connection to their own cultural identity and to each other. Other women faced fates that ancient sources describe in terms that suggest they were considered worse than death, worse than slavery, worse than any physical torture. These were fates that involved the complete erasure of identity, forced reproduction under circumstances that destroyed the women psychologically, and the creation of children who would grow up as Spartans serving the very system that had destroyed their mothers' original families and cities. Let me tell you about the systematic forced marriage practices that Sparta employed with captured noblewomen, because these practices reveal the sophisticated cruelty of Spartan conquest strategy. When a city was conquered, the wives and daughters of the enemy's ruling class, the women who had been the most prominent in the defeated society, were specifically identified and set aside. These women had value to Sparta, not as laborers, but as symbols of the defeated enemy's total subjugation, and as vessels for producing children who would have mixed heritage but Spartan identity. These noble women would be assigned as wives or concubines to Spartan citizens, particularly to Spartan men who were older and had not yet produced children, or who had lost wives and needed to produce more offspring to maintain the citizen population. The assignments were made by Spartan authorities, not by the women or even necessarily by the Spartan men receiving them. This was state policy, designed to serve state interests. The forced marriages served multiple purposes. First, they humiliated the defeated enemy by demonstrating that even their highest-ranking women, the wives and daughters of their leaders, were now property to be distributed to Spartans. Second, they produced children who would be raised as Spartans but who carried the blood of the conquered people, creating a visible demonstration that the conquered population had been absorbed into Sparta. Third, they prevented these women from bearing children who might grow up as members of the defeated culture with grievances against Sparta. Ancient sources, including Plutarch, describe how these forced marriages were sometimes conducted as public ceremonies, rituals designed to demonstrate Sparta's total victory. The captured woman would be dressed in wedding garments and brought before the Spartan community. She would be formally married to her assigned Spartan husband in a ceremony that mimicked traditional Greek wedding rituals, but that everyone understood was actually a display of conquest and subjugation. The woman would be forced to participate in the ceremony, to speak the required words, to go through the motions of a willing bride, while everyone present knew she was a captive whose former husband had likely been killed by Spartans days or weeks earlier. After the ceremony, the woman would be taken to her new husband's household. There, she would be expected to fulfill all the duties of a Spartan wife, managing the household, bearing children, raising those children as Spartans. But she would always be marked as a captive, as an outsider, as someone whose presence in the household was a reminder of Spartan conquest. The children she bore would be considered Spartan citizens if the father was a Spartan citizen, but they would carry the knowledge of their mother's origin, would grow up hearing, or not hearing, which was perhaps worse, about the city their mother came from and the family she had lost. For the captured woman, this fate was described by contemporary sources as worse than death, because it involved not just survival under subjugation, but active participation in the destruction of her own culture. She would be forced to raise children as Spartans, teaching them Spartan values, watching them grow up to potentially become warriors who might fight against any remnants of her original people. She would be forced to manage a household for the man whose people had killed her first husband, destroyed her city, and stolen her from her children if she had any. She would live every day in a state between captivity and marriage, neither free nor simply enslaved, but occupying a role that required her to perform normalcy while experiencing ongoing trauma. Ancient accounts suggest that some women found ways to adapt to these circumstances, to create lives within the constraints imposed on them. They might form attachments to their new children, even while mourning the families they had lost. They might find small dignities or small rebellions within their households. But sources also describe women who never adapted, who lived their entire lives in states of depression or grief, who refused to fully participate in Spartan society even when doing so brought punishment. Some women reportedly took their own lives rather than accept these forced marriages. Plutarch and other sources describe instances of captured noblewomen choosing death over dishonor, throwing themselves from cliffs or finding other means of escape before they could be assigned to Spartan husbands. These deaths were sometimes portrayed in Greek literature as examples of feminine virtue and honor, women choosing death to preserve their loyalty to their deceased husbands and their original cities. But the fact that such choices were necessary, that women had to choose between death and forced marriage to their conquerors, reveals the horror of the system Sparta had created. But forced marriages to Spartan citizens were not the only fate that captured women faced. Let me tell you about another practice that ancient sources describe in terms even more horrifying: the systematic use of captured women in what can only be described as state-directed breeding programs designed to produce specific types of offspring for Spartan purposes. Sparta's ideology emphasized the importance of producing strong warriors. Spartan citizens practiced selective breeding in their own population. Women were encouraged to engage in physical training to make them strong mothers. Marriages were arranged to produce the best offspring. And as I mentioned earlier, infants deemed too weak were eliminated. This eugenic ideology extended to how Sparta dealt with conquered populations. Some captured women, particularly those from populations that Spartans considered to have desirable characteristics: height, strength, beauty, intelligence, were assigned not as wives to Spartan citizens, but as what sources obliquely refer to as breeding partners, in arrangements designed to produce children for specific purposes. These arrangements are referenced in fragments of ancient texts, and in later accounts that drew on earlier sources now lost. The details are sometimes vague because Greek writers were often uncomfortable describing these practices explicitly, but the basic outline is clear enough. Women might be paired with Spartan men, specifically to produce children who would be raised as Spartans, but who carried traits from the conquered population. Or they might be paired with helots, enslaved men of mixed or non-Spartan origin, to produce children who would be born into helot status, but who would have specific characteristics that made them valuable for particular types of labor or service. These arrangements were not marriages in any meaningful sense. They were reproductive assignments, treating both the women and sometimes the men as breeding stock, their value determined entirely by the children they might produce and the purposes those children might serve. The women in these arrangements had no legal protections, no social status, no ability to refuse or to leave. They existed to bear children according to Spartan state planning, and their lives were defined entirely by that reproductive function. The children born from these unions occupied complicated positions in Spartan society. If born to a Spartan father and a captured mother, they might be considered citizens, but would always carry the taint of mixed heritage. If born to helot fathers, or in arrangements that did not involve citizen fathers, they would be helots themselves, born into slavery, inheriting their mother's subjugated status. These children grew up knowing they were products of conquest, that their existence served Spartan interests, that their mothers had been targeted and used specifically to produce them. For the mothers, bearing children under these circumstances created profound psychological conflict. The children were their children, and maternal attachment is powerful. But the children were also products of arrangements the mothers had not chosen, growing up to serve the people who had destroyed the mother's original families. Sources suggest that some mothers in these situations were able to love their children despite the circumstances of their conception. Others struggled with resentment or grief, that complicated their relationships with offspring, who reminded them constantly of their subjugation. The systematic nature of these practices is important to understand. This was not random violence or individual soldiers acting on their own impulses. This was state policy, implemented according to plans made by Spartan authorities, designed to serve strategic objectives. The targeting of women for reproductive purposes was as carefully planned as military campaigns, and the results, children of mixed heritage who would serve Spartan interests, were intended outcomes that supported Sparta's long-term dominance. Now let me tell you about the helot system and how captured women were integrated into this massive enslaved population, because this was the fate of many, if not most, women from conquered territories. The helots were the foundation of Spartan society, the enslaved population that worked the land and allowed Spartan citizens to focus entirely on warfare. Helots were state property rather than owned by individual Spartans, though they were assigned to work specific Spartan landholdings. They could not be bought or sold individually like slaves in some other societies, but they also could never earn freedom. Halo status was hereditary. Children of helots were born helots and would remain helots for life, as would their children and all subsequent generations. Captured women who became helots faced lives of grinding labor and brutal treatment. Female helots worked in Spartan fields during planting and harvest, worked in Spartan households as domestic servants, worked in workshops producing goods for Spartan use. The work was endless and exhausting, the conditions harsh, the treatment often cruel. Helos were regularly beaten to reinforce their subjugated status. They were given minimal food and clothing. They were forbidden from aspiring to anything beyond their assigned labor. But beyond the physical labor, female helots faced specific vulnerabilities related to their gender. They were sexually available to Spartan citizens in ways that reflected their complete lack of legal protection or bodily autonomy. A Spartan man could force himself on a helot woman without consequence. This was not considered a crime because helots were property, not people with rights. The children born from these violations would be helots, adding to the enslaved population. Some helot women were assigned specifically to domestic work in Spartan households, where they served as servants, wet nurses for Spartan children, and were available for whatever purposes their Spartan masters determined. They might spend decades working in a household, watching Spartan children grow up while their own children labored in fields, never able to leave, never able to refuse any demand made of them. The psychological dimensions of helot life for captured women were in some ways worse than the physical hardships. These women had come from cities where they had been free, where they had identities and social positions, where they had families and futures. Now they were property, their lives reduced to labor and survival, their children born into the same permanent servitude. They lived surrounded by other helots, many of whom had been enslaved for generations, and they saw in those multi-generational helot families their own future. Not just their own enslavement, but their children's and grandchildren's, extending forever with no hope of change. Sparta maintained the helot system through systematic terror. The Spartans understood that helots vastly outnumbered citizens, and that if helots ever organized effective resistance, they could potentially overwhelm their masters. So Sparta employed practices designed to keep helots fearful and divided. One such practice was the crypteia, a rite of passage for young Spartan men that involved secretly hunting and killing helots who were deemed dangerous or uppity. Young Spartans would be sent into the countryside with weapons and instructions to kill helots who seemed strong or bold, or who showed signs of potential leadership. Helot women were sometimes targets of the crypteia if they were seen as troublemakers, or if they simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The crypteia served multiple purposes. It gave young Spartans practice in stalking and killing while reinforcing the ideology that helots were enemies to be eliminated without mercy. It terrorized the helot population by demonstrating that any helot could be killed at any time for any reason or no reason. It eliminated helots who might become leaders of resistance. The practice was designed to maintain fear and submission across the entire helot population. For helot women, particularly those who had been captured from conquered cities and who remembered freedom, the krypteia was a constant threat hanging over their lives. They lived knowing that showing too much spirit or capability might mark them for elimination. They learned to make themselves invisible, to suppress any qualities that might be interpreted as dangerous, to teach their children to do the same. The psychological weight of living under this constant threat, combined with the physical hardships of helot labor, created lives defined by fear and exhaustion. Now, let me tell you about the public humiliation practices that Sparta employed with captured women, because these reveal how Sparta used ritual degradation as a weapon of psychological warfare. When Sparta won major victories, particularly against traditional enemies like Argos or Athens or Thebes, the celebrations would include rituals designed to demonstrate total domination over the defeated enemy. These rituals specifically targeted women as symbols of the enemy's subjugation. Captured women would be paraded through Spartan territory, displayed as living trophies of victory. The parades might happen immediately after a city was conquered, or later during festivals celebrating Spartan military achievements. The women would be stripped of whatever noble dress they might have worn and dressed instead as servants or slaves. If they had been prominent in their original cities, wives of leaders, priestesses, women of high status, their fall would be made as visible as possible. The women would be marched through Spartan territory while citizens watched and jeered. Spartan women, who themselves occupied a unique position in Greek society with more freedom and authority than women in most other Greek cities, would sometimes participate in mocking captured women. The Spartan women would shout insults about the captured women's weakness, their failure to produce warriors strong enough to defend their cities, their inferior status compared to Spartan women who produced Sparta's dominant warriors. This gendered aspect of the humiliation was particularly cruel. The captured women were being mocked by other women, their shared gender providing no protection or solidarity, but instead becoming another vector for humiliation. The Spartan women's participation demonstrated how completely Spartan ideology had shaped their worldview, how they had internalized beliefs about Spartan superiority so thoroughly that they could participate in degrading women from other cities without apparent sympathy. The parades and public displays served strategic purposes beyond simply entertaining Spartans. They created stories that would spread throughout the Greek world. Other cities would hear about what happened to women from cities that resisted Sparta, would hear about the public humiliation and degradation that awaited not just defeated warriors but their wives and daughters. This knowledge was designed to make cities more likely to surrender to Sparta rather than risk having their women subjected to such treatment. The rituals also reinforced Spartan identity by creating clear contrasts between Spartans and others. Spartan men were strong conquerors. Other men were weak and defeated. Spartan women were proud participants in military culture. Other women were captives and servants. By participating in these rituals of humiliation, Spartans reinforced their own sense of superiority and their commitment to maintaining the system that gave them dominance over others. Ancient sources, particularly Plutarch, describe these practices with a mix of admiration for Spartan military prowess and discomfort with the treatment of captured populations. Greek writers were generally comfortable with slavery and with the idea that defeat in war brought loss of freedom. But some aspects of Spartan treatment of captured women seemed to trouble even writers who accepted the general framework of ancient warfare. The systematic nature of the practices, the deliberate psychological cruelty, the targeting of women specifically to destroy enemy cultures. These were remarkable even in a world where brutality was common. Let me tell you about specific historical examples that illustrate these practices, starting with the Messenian Wars, the conflicts that established the helot system, and that showed how Sparta dealt with conquered populations on a massive scale. The Messenians were Greek people who lived in territory west of Sparta, in the region called Messenia. In the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Sparta conducted two major wars to conquer Messenia, wars that lasted for decades, and that ended with the entire Messenian population being enslaved. The Second Messenian War, which lasted from approximately 685 to 668 BCE, ended with Sparta conquering the remaining free Messenians and incorporating them into the helot system. Ancient sources describe how the Spartan victory involved not just defeating Messenian armies, but systematically subjugating the entire population. Messenian women became helots, assigned to work Spartan land, their children born into permanent servitude. The Messenians had been free Greeks, culturally similar to Spartans, but after the conquest they were reduced to state property, defined entirely by their subjugation to Sparta. For generations afterward, the helot population included huge numbers of Messenians who remembered or had been told about their people's free existence before Spartan conquest. This created a permanent source of potential resistance that shaped Spartan policy for centuries. The Spartans dealt with this threat through systematic brutality. The crypteia that I described earlier was implemented specifically to terrorize helots of Messenian descent, and helot rebellions, when they occurred, were suppressed with mass killings. Messenian women raised children who were born into slavery, teaching them about their people's history while knowing that any overt resistance would be crushed. Some families maintained Messenian cultural traditions in secret, passing down stories and customs across generations of enslavement. But the conditions of helot life made cultural transmission difficult and dangerous. The women who had been free before the conquest lived and died as slaves, watching their children and grandchildren endure the same fate with no hope of change. The psychological weight of this knowledge, that your people had been free, that your enslavement was the result of military defeat rather than any inherent status, that freedom was not just a distant dream, but a remembered reality that had been taken away, made the helot condition particularly unbearable for Messenians. Ancient sources suggest that Messenian helots were more likely to resist, and therefore were treated more harshly than helots from other origins, creating a cycle of resistance and repression that characterized Spartan-Messenian relations for centuries. Let me tell you about more recent examples from Sparta's classical period, the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, when Sparta was at the height of its power and engaged in numerous wars with other Greek city-states. During the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, that lasted from 431 to 404 BCE, Sparta captured numerous Athenian and allied cities. The treatment of captured populations followed the patterns I've described, with women being enslaved, forcibly married, or otherwise absorbed into the Spartan system. After Athens' catastrophic defeat in Sicily in 413 BCE, thousands of Athenian soldiers were captured by Syracuse, a Spartan ally. Many of these soldiers had wives and families in Athens, or in Athenian-controlled cities. When Sparta and its allies subsequently captured some of these cities, the wives of captured or killed Athenian soldiers faced the fates I've described. Some became helots. Some were assigned as wives to Spartan citizens or allies. Their children, if they had any, were either left behind or raised in circumstances defined by their mother's captive status. Plutarch describes how captured Athenian women, particularly those from prominent families, were sometimes used by Sparta as tools for political manipulation. A captured woman might be returned to Athens or to her family, but only after being held for months or years, only after experiencing treatment designed to humiliate her and her family, only after Sparta had extracted whatever political advantage they could from her captivity. The treatment of these women was designed to send messages, to demonstrate Sparta's power, to punish Athens for resistance, to show that even Athenian nobility had no protection against Spartan dominance. Similarly, during Sparta's wars with Thebes, particularly after the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, where Thebes defeated Sparta in a major upset, the treatment of captured women became a subject of revenge and counter-revenge. Thebans, having suffered under Spartan domination for decades, reportedly treated captured Spartan women with particular harshness, employing some of the same methods Sparta had used against others. Ancient sources describe this as a reversal of fortune, with the formerly dominant Spartans now experiencing what they had inflicted on others. These examples reveal how the treatment of captured women was woven into the broader patterns of Greek warfare and interstate relations during the classical period. It was not an aberration or a practice that other Greeks found incomprehensible. Rather, it was an extension of commonly accepted practices, slavery, forced marriage, control of reproduction, that Sparta had systematized and implemented with particular thoroughness and cruelty. Now, let me tell you about the religious and ideological frameworks that Spartans used to justify these practices, because understanding the justifications is crucial to understanding how systematic cruelty can be normalized and perpetuated across generations. The Spartans believed that their military dominance was divinely ordained, that the gods had made them superior to other Greeks and had given them the right to rule over inferior populations. This belief was reinforced through religious rituals, through education in the agoge, through every aspect of Spartan culture. Spartan mythology included stories of divine ancestors and divine favor. The Spartans claimed descent from Heracles and believed they were carrying out divine will when they conquered other populations. When they enslaved the Messenians or captured women from other cities, these actions were framed not as cruelty, but as proper ordering of the world according to divine plan. The strong should dominate the weak. Those favored by gods should rule those who were not. Resistance to Sparta was resistance to divine order, and therefore deserved whatever punishment Sparta imposed. This religious framing made Spartan practices seem not just acceptable, but righteous to Spartans themselves. A Spartan warrior forcing himself on a helot woman was not committing a crime, but exercising his God-given right to dominate inferior people. A Spartan man assigned a captured wife was not participating in cruelty, but accepting his duty to absorb defeated enemies into Spartan society. The systematic brutality of the helot system was not oppression, but necessary maintenance of proper social order ordained by the gods. Some ancient sources describe instances where captured women were dedicated to temples or assigned to religious service, though the details are often unclear. These arrangements might sound like they offered protection. Surely women serving the gods would be treated better than those who were enslaved or forcibly married, but the reality was more complicated. Women assigned to temple service were still captives, still separated from their original lives, still serving the society that had conquered them. And temple service could involve its own forms of exploitation under the guise of religious duty. The use of religious language and frameworks to justify treatment of captured women was not unique to Sparta. It was common throughout the ancient world, and indeed throughout history. But Sparta's particular combination of military culture, systematic enslavement, and ideological certainty created a framework where extreme practices could be implemented as normal policy without apparent moral qualms from those carrying them out. Now, let me tell you about the long-term consequences of these practices, both for individuals and for the broader pattern of Greek warfare and conquest. For individual women who experienced these fates, the consequences were devastating and permanent. A woman captured from a conquered city would never return to her original life. Her identity as a member of her birth community was erased or permanently damaged. Her children, if she had any before capture, were lost to her. Children born after capture would be Spartans or helots, raised with different identities, different loyalties. She would live the rest of her life in a state of permanent displacement, never fully belonging anywhere, always marked as a captive or former enemy. The psychological trauma of these experiences must have been profound, though ancient sources rarely explored the inner lives of captured women in ways that would let us fully understand their experiences. We have scattered references to women who grieved, who resisted, who adapted, who despaired. We have brief mentions of captured women who maintained their dignity despite circumstances, or who found ways to preserve some connection to their original identities. But most captured women disappeared into the historical record, their individual stories lost, their experiences recorded, if at all, only as statistics. Women of X city were captured and enslaved, without detail or follow-up about their fates. For their children and descendants, the consequences extended across generations. Children born to captive mothers grew up in complicated positions, sometimes knowing about their mother's origins, but unable to act on that knowledge, sometimes kept ignorant of their heritage as part of their integration into Spartan society. Mixed heritage individuals occupied uncertain spaces in the rigid Spartan social hierarchy, sometimes able to rise to positions of significance, but always carrying the taint of non-Spartan origin, always potentially vulnerable to reminders that they were not fully part of the elite warrior class. The helot population, swelled by generation after generation of people born into inherited slavery, represented a permanent underclass that shaped Spartan society in fundamental ways. The need to control helots influenced Spartan military strategy. Sparta was often reluctant to commit its full army to distant campaigns because doing so might create opportunities for helot rebellion. The fear of helot uprising shaped Spartan domestic policy, leading to the systematic terror of the Crypteia and to laws limiting helot movement in assembly. The existence of this massive enslaved population made Sparta wealthy enough to support its warrior class, but also made Sparta vulnerable in ways that would eventually contribute to its decline. On a broader level, Sparta's practices influenced how other Greek city-states thought about and dealt with conquered populations. While Sparta was extreme in its systematization of these practices, other cities employed similar methods when they could. The idea that capturing enemy women and controlling their reproduction was a legitimate tool of conquest was widely accepted in the Greek world. Athens, Thebes, and other cities that were rivals or enemies of Sparta all practiced forms of slavery, all took captives in war, all employed the reproductive labor of enslaved women. But Sparta's particular reputation for systematic cruelty and for thoroughgoing subjugation of conquered populations made other Greeks both fearful and critical. Ancient writers expressed discomfort with Spartan practices, even while acknowledging Spartan military effectiveness. The tension between admiration for Spartan warrior prowess and discomfort with Spartan treatment of helots and captives runs through many ancient texts about Sparta. This tension reflected a broader ambivalence in Greek culture about conquest and slavery. Greeks generally accepted that defeat in war could lead to enslavement and that victors had rights over defeated populations. But there were also Greek philosophical traditions that questioned whether such treatment was just, whether all people deserved certain basic dignities, whether the permanent subjugation of populations like the helots was sustainable or ethical. These debates influenced political philosophy and ethics in ways that would echo through Western thought for millennia. Now, returning to Umelia, the woman we met at the beginning, I promised I would tell you what happened to her after she was marched away from Mantinea, along with the other captured women. The historical records do not preserve individual stories of women from Mantinea's fall, but we can reconstruct the likely possibilities based on what sources tell us about Spartan practices during this period. The women captured from Mantinea would have arrived in Sparta after a several-day march. They would have been exhausted, terrified, grieving for the families and lives they had lost. Upon arrival, they would have been assessed by Spartan authorities and divided according to the categories I described earlier. Some would have been sent to work as helots on Spartan agricultural lands. Some would have been assigned to domestic service in Spartan households. Some, the younger, healthier, or higher status women, would have been designated for forced marriages or breeding arrangements. A woman like Umelia, 26 years old, widow of a warrior, mother of 3, from a city that had resisted Sparta, would have been a prime candidate for forced marriage to a Spartan citizen. She was old enough to be experienced, but young enough to potentially bear several more children. Her fertility was proven by her existing children. Her husband's warrior status suggested she came from a respectable family. She would have been valuable to Sparta as a potential mother of future Spartan citizens. Most likely, Umelia would have been assigned to a Spartan man who needed a wife, perhaps a man whose previous wife had died, or an older man who had not yet married, or a warrior who had lost his wife and needed someone to manage his household and bear his children. The assignment would have been made without consulting Umelia. She would have been informed of her new status and expected to accept it. Umelia would have been taken to her assigned husband's household. There she would have met the man who would be her master and husband, the man whose people had destroyed her city and killed her first husband. She would have been expected to manage his household, to submit to him, to bear his children if she could. And she would have had to do all of this while knowing that her 3 children from her first marriage were somewhere in Spartan-controlled territory, possibly enslaved, possibly adopted by other families, but in any case separated from her with little hope that she would ever see them again. The rest of Umelia's life, which might have lasted decades if she survived the health challenges of ancient life, would have been spent in this strange state between captivity and marriage. She would have lived in a Spartan household, surrounded by Spartan customs and Spartan ideology, expected to adopt Spartan ways. If she bore children to her Spartan husband, she would have had to raise them as Spartans, teaching them to value Spartan virtues, watching them grow up to potentially become warriors who might someday fight against other Greeks, including, perhaps, remnants of her original city. She would have carried her grief and her trauma silently, probably not allowed or able to speak openly about her former life or her losses. She might have found ways to remember her first husband and her lost children privately, but publicly she would have had to present herself as a Spartan wife, committed to her new household and new life. The psychological strain of this constant performance, of living a life that required her to pretend that her subjugation was a normal marriage, must have been exhausting and devastating. Some women in circumstances like Umelia's would have found ways to adapt, to create new attachments, to find meaning in their new lives, despite the circumstances that created them. Human beings are remarkably resilient and capable of forming connections even in dire situations. A woman forced into marriage with her conqueror might develop genuine feelings for children born from that marriage, might find ways to take pride in managing a household well, might create friendships with other women in similar circumstances. But adaptation did not mean acceptance or happiness. Ancient sources suggest that women in these situations often lived with permanent grief and anger that they had to keep hidden. They might go through the motions of Spartan life while internally remaining loyal to their original identities and mourning what they had lost. They might teach their children small things about their heritage in secret, or maintain private rituals connected to their birth cities. Or they might try to forget, to suppress memories that were too painful to carry, to convince themselves that their current lives were their only reality. We don't know which path Umelia took or what the rest of her life was like. The historical record does not preserve her individual story, but we know that thousands of women across the centuries of Spartan expansion experienced similar fates, that each of them had to find ways to survive circumstances that were, by any measure, worse than death for many people in ancient Greek culture. Death in battle was honored. Death in defense of one's city was glorious. But survival as a captive, forced marriage to one's conquerors, raising children for the people who had destroyed one's original family. This was degradation, dishonor, a living death that lasted for decades. Now let me tell you why ancient sources described these fates as worse than death. Because understanding this requires understanding ancient Greek values and how these practices violated those values in specific ways. In ancient Greek culture, particularly for people of citizen status, honor was paramount. Honor was tied to autonomy, to family, to one's position in society. A person's identity was defined by their city, their family lineage, their role in their community. Death could be honorable if it came in defense of these things. But loss of autonomy, separation from family, erasure of identity, these were devastating in ways that death was not. For women specifically, honor was tied to chastity within proper marriage, to loyalty to husband and family, to managing a household well. A married woman was expected to be faithful to her husband for life. Widows were expected to honor their deceased husband's memory. A woman who was forced to marry her husband's killers, who was made to bear children to those enemies, who was required to manage a household for the people who had destroyed her original home. This violated every expectation of feminine honor in Greek culture. The fact that these violations were forced did not fully protect a woman's honor in ancient thinking. While Greeks acknowledged that captives were not freely choosing their circumstances, there was still a taint attached to women who had been sexually involved with men other than their rightful husbands. Even when that involvement was forced, a woman who survived captivity and forced marriage would be seen as diminished, as having lost something essential, even though she bore no moral responsibility for that loss. This is why ancient sources sometimes praise women who chose suicide rather than captivity, portraying such choices as the ultimate demonstration of virtue and honor. A woman who killed herself rather than be forced into marriage with her conquerors was preserving her honor through death. Her loyalty to her deceased husband remained intact. Her identity, as a member of her original city, remained uncompromised. Death became the only way to maintain dignity in circumstances where survival meant permanent dishonor. But the phrase "worse than death" also captures something about the nature of ongoing suffering versus the finality of death. Death ends suffering. Death provides closure. But the fates that captured women faced meant decades of ongoing suffering, of daily reminders of what had been lost, of constant re-traumatization as they lived among the people who had destroyed their original lives. There was no closure, no end, just an indefinite extension of grief and subjugation. The children born from these forced marriages embodied this ongoing tragedy. For the mothers, these children represented both deep attachment, they were her children after all, and deep pain, they were products of her captivity, reminders of what had been taken from her. The children themselves, if they learned of their mother's origins, might struggle with their own identities, knowing they carried the blood of both conquerors and conquered, trying to make sense of their place in a society built on the subjugation of their maternal ancestors. This intergenerational trauma was part of what made the Spartan system so effective and so devastating. The damage did not end with one generation. It carried forward, creating families and individuals who bore the psychological and social scars of conquest for their entire lives, and who passed some of those scars on to their own descendants. Now, let me tell you about how this system eventually contributed to Sparta's decline, because the very practices that built Spartan power also contain the seeds of Sparta's eventual fall from dominance. The helot system that Sparta depended on required constant military vigilance to prevent rebellion. This need to control helots limited Sparta's ability to project power effectively, because leaving Sparta with insufficient forces risked helot uprising. The fear of helots shaped Spartan strategy in ways that sometimes prevented Sparta from pursuing opportunities or alliances that would have strengthened its position. Additionally, the Spartan citizen population was relatively small and was declining over time. Sparta had perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 full citizens at its height, compared to much larger citizen populations in Athens and other rivals. Spartan laws about citizenship and inheritance made it difficult for the citizen population to grow, and war losses reduced it further. The emphasis on producing warriors through strict biological and social standards meant that many potential citizens were excluded, reducing Sparta's human resources. The capture and forced marriage of women from conquered cities should theoretically have helped maintain Sparta's population by producing more children. But the complex social hierarchies around citizen status meant that many children born to captive mothers were not full citizens, or were considered inferior even when technically citizens. The systematic cruelty that defined Spartan treatment of conquered populations also created lasting resentment and resistance that drained Spartan resources. When Sparta finally lost its military dominance in the 4th century BCE, particularly after defeats by Thebes, the helot system began to crumble. Thebes deliberately encouraged helot rebellion as part of its strategy against Sparta. The Messenians, who had been enslaved for centuries, finally gained freedom when Thebes helped establish an independent Messenian state in 369 BCE. The loss of Messenia and its helot population devastated Sparta's economy and military power because Sparta's warrior class had depended entirely on helot labor. As Sparta declined, the populations that had suffered under Spartan domination felt little sympathy. The memories of how Sparta had treated conquered populations, particularly women, meant that few were willing to help Sparta in its time of weakness. The cruelty that had built Spartan power became part of the reason other Greeks were willing to see Sparta fall. The irony is that Sparta's systematic brutality, which seemed like strength and which did produce centuries of military dominance, ultimately undermined the very power it was designed to maintain. By creating such deep resentment among subject populations, by reducing everything to force and fear, by treating conquered peoples with such systematic cruelty, Sparta ensured that when its military power weakened, there would be no goodwill or loyalty to fall back on, only the accumulated rage of populations who had suffered under Spartan domination and who seized the first opportunity to break free. This pattern, where systematic cruelty creates short-term dominance but long-term instability, appears throughout history. Empires built purely on force and fear tend to be fragile, collapsing quickly when their military power weakens because they have created no bonds of loyalty or cooperation, only resentment waiting for the chance to express itself. Sparta is perhaps the most extreme ancient example of this dynamic, a state so committed to force as the sole basis of power that it created nothing else to hold its system together. Now, as we reach the end of this history, let me tell you what we should take away from understanding these practices. The story of what Spartans did to wives of defeated warriors is not just ancient history. It's a case study in how systematic targeting of women has been used as a weapon of war, how reproductive control has functioned as a tool of conquest, how the erasure of cultural identity has been implemented across generations. These practices worked in achieving their immediate objectives. Sparta maintained dominance over subject populations for centuries. Captured women were successfully absorbed into Spartan society in ways that prevented them from raising children who might resist Sparta. The helot system provided the economic foundation for Spartan military power. The terror that Sparta inspired made other cities hesitant to resist, but the human cost was immeasurable. Thousands of women experienced fates that ancient sources describe as worse than death. Families were destroyed. Children grew up separated from their mothers or raised in circumstances defined by their mother's subjugation. Generations of people lived as helots, inheriting enslaved status, denied freedom or dignity. The psychological trauma extended across multiple generations. Understanding this history helps us recognize patterns that have appeared throughout history in different forms. The systematic targeting of women in warfare, the use of forced reproduction as a weapon, the deliberate erasure of cultural identity through controlling how children are raised. These patterns did not end with Sparta. They have appeared in conquest and colonization throughout history, in chattel slavery systems, in modern conflicts where control of reproduction and erasure of identity remain weapons. Recognizing these patterns is crucial to preventing their recurrence and to supporting survivors when they do occur. The women who experienced these fates in ancient Sparta, like women who have experienced similar targeting throughout history, deserve to be remembered not as abstract victims or as symbols, but as human beings who suffered, who survived or did not survive, who tried to maintain dignity under circumstances designed to destroy it. What do you think about this history? How should we remember Sparta for its military achievements, or for the systematic cruelty that those achievements required? Can we acknowledge both? How do we honor the memory of people like Umelia and the thousands of other women whose individual stories are lost, but whose collective experience shaped ancient history? Leave your comments below. If you believe this history needs to be told, that understanding how systematic targeting of women has functioned as a weapon of war is crucial to preventing similar practices in the future, then subscribe to this channel and share this video. Hit that subscribe button right now. The ruins of ancient Sparta still exist in modern Greece. Tourists visit them, walking among the remains of temples and theaters and training grounds where young Spartans learned to be warriors. But the helot villages where captured women lived in slavery are gone, unmarked, their locations lost to history. The households where captive wives raised children for their conquerors are forgotten. The individual graves of women like Umelia, if they had graves at all, are anonymous and lost. The stones do not remember these women. The ancient sources barely recorded their experiences, but they existed. They suffered. Their lives were shaped by conquest practices that targeted them, specifically because of their gender and their reproductive potential. Their experiences, multiplied across thousands of women over centuries, represent a massive human cost that underlies the story of Spartan power. Remember Umelia, separated from her children and forced into a marriage with her conquerors. Remember the Messenian women enslaved for generations, maintaining fragments of cultural memory across centuries of servitude. Remember the captured noblewomen displayed in humiliating parades to demonstrate Sparta's dominance. Remember all the women whose names we do not know, whose individual stories are lost, but whose collective experience reveals the true cost of military conquest built on systematic targeting of women. They were people. They loved their children. They grieved for their losses. They tried to survive impossible circumstances. They existed, and they deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to Spartan military history, but as human beings whose suffering was not incidental to conquest, but central to how ancient warfare functioned, whose treatment reveals truths about power and gender and violence that remain relevant today. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.